Welcome back to Real Takes, where we are all movie love all the time. I'm Stott, and tonight we are continuing our new tradition of highlighting an organization that I think is doing really important work before we move on to shining movie love on a film that I think is also important. We have had another devastating week in this country with the largest school shooting since the school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut 10 years ago. This shooting was in Texas yesterday and killed 18 students and a teacher and the grandmother of the shooter. We desperately need sensible gun laws in this country and restrictions and bans on certain weapons. And Everytown for Gun Safety is working to make that a reality. The majority of Americans want that, and that agenda is being held hostage by a radicalized minority in this country, and we need to overcome them. So please check out Everytown for Gun Safety. I will be linking to them in the comments below, and I hope you can support them or some other organization working for sensible gun laws. Once again, I would very much love to have a second camera so I could create some kind of mood shift, since this issue of gun safety is so painful. And I also want to say that, you know, my heart is with the people suffering in Texas right now as the result of this violence. And now we are going to move on to the movie portion of the show. Tonight, it's actually appropriate. We are shining all the movie love on 9 Days, which came out in 2020, which is a movie about how we move through painful, tragic experiences and how we can value what's beautiful and wonderful about life in the midst of those pains and those challenges. I'll also say that we are now in Gemini season. We have crossed over into the time of Gemini. Geminis are the communicators. Their ruling planet is Mercury. They're an air sign, so ideas are flying fast and furious. And there are many, many great Gemini directors. So two of the greatest women directors of the last 100 years were Gemini, Chantal Akerman and Agnes Varda. We'll be talking about both of them this month. In terms of classic cinema, the great Howard Hawks was a Gemini. And in fact, I think of Howard Hawks movies like His Girl Friday and Bringing Up Baby as like Gemini films, like that fast and furious dialogue and people talking over each other and like one smart quip being bested by another smart quip after another. That's all Gemini energy in my world. Joseph von Sternberg is a Gemini, and we will be talking about him and his partnership with Marlene Dietrich later in the month. Rainier Werner Fassbinder was a Gemini. Yorgos Lanthimos is a Gemini. Stephen Frears, Ryan Coogler, Paolo Sorrentino, Lana Wachowski is a Gemini, and Hirokazu Kore-eda is a Gemini, which is particularly important for us because his movie Afterlife, which we talked about in the fall, is a big influence on the movie we're talking about today, 9 Days, which was written and directed by Edson Oda. Now, Edson Oda, I don't know what his sign is. I can't find his birthday online, but the movie stars Winston Duke, Benedict Wong, Bill Skarsgaard, and David Rysdale, and it also stars Zazie Beetz, who is a Gemini and who I am loving seeing on screen more and more and more. Zazie Beetz has been working for about 10 years. She's a German-American actress who was raised in New York City. Her father's German, her mother's African-American. Actually, in a great interview I saw, she was like, oh, I'm from Washington Heights. And then she said, well, then my mother moved to Harlem, so I'm kind of from both, which was so New York to hear, like acknowledging that these two neighborhoods that are literally less than a mile apart are actually, you know, separate worlds. I just loved hearing that. And she has been in some hit TV shows. She's on Atlanta. She's also on Invincible. She's been in Deadpool 2. She killed it in The Harder They Fall, the revisionist Western that came out last year. She was also in The Joker, so she's just nailing it over and over again. And her birthday is coming up later this week, so we are celebrating Zazie Beetz, Gemini actress on the rise, whose work I just love every time I see her. And she is a communicator. Her passion and her energy just kind of come right out of her in whatever she's doing, and I'm looking forward to seeing all the things she does next. So 9 Days has been described as a sci-fi drama, or a high concept sci-fi, but you have to let go of any sort of traditional or stereotypical ideas you have about sci-fi movies. We're not on a spaceship. We're not on another planet. There are no, laser swords. Nobody's getting beamed anywhere exactly. There are a bunch of ways this is different from a sci-fi. Actually, Benedict Wong, who was in it, he calls it a spy-fi, a spiritual fiction. I would call it like a mystical fiction drama, maybe. But there are a couple things that really separate it from being, again, a more traditional, stereotypical sci-fi. And one of them is that even though we are in an otherworldly space, the otherworldly space is grounded in familiar, tactile experiences of this earthly reality. It's just the way they're brought together that makes them, to use Edson Oda's words, the writer-director, more surreal. And then the other way that I think this differs from a lot of sci-fis, which are really plot-driven, and they might have great characters, but the story is very much about plot and conflict. This is a deeply character-driven movie. So we are in a liminal space. We're in an in-between space in 9 Days. And as Edson Oda has said, we're in this space. We're in the desert. We're actually in the salt flats they shot in Utah. And then there's a house in the desert. And as he has said, a house is a totally familiar thing for people to see. And the desert is, a totally normal part of the earth that we've either experienced personally or seen in pictures. But when you put a house in the middle of a desert, that immediately creates like an otherworldly feeling, because that's not what we usually see, right? So the sci-fi is happening on that kind of level. And in this house lives Will, our main character, played by Winston Duke, who was once alive in this temporal realm, but he is now an interviewer who interviews souls and chooses one who then gets to be born into this temporal realm. And once he chooses these souls, he monitors their lives on a series of screens. And when someone dies, then it goes through another process of interviewing a series of souls and deciding which one will then be born and have life. So there's a lot to talk about here about world building in films. And obviously every film has to build a world, whether it's a totally known world, and we can make choices, filmmakers can make choices about, a suburban world that some people might consider a happy place, but they make it look like a dark place, or an urban world that, it takes on a comic element, or, so there's always a lot of conscious world building in cinema, even when the world is in this temporal reality. But then when we step outside the rules and the conventions of this temporal reality, world building becomes even more important. And like I said, this film is heavily influenced by Kore-eda's Afterlife, which we did talk about in the fall, and I will link to in the descriptions if you want to watch that episode. And please watch the film, it's so beautiful. And Afterlife is set in a building where souls come just after they've died, and they spend a week and they get to choose one memory that they take with them when they go. That these sort of social work type characters help them remember and then flesh out. So 9 Days is sort of the flip side of that. It's about souls going into life rather than coming out of life. And it's about Will, who's making this choice, right? And part of what I love about this film, or one of the many things I love about this film, is that it's high concept, lo-fi, and I always love that smash up. So even though we're in this liminal, otherworldly space, and now in 2022, I'm getting lost. We live in this high-tech world where it could have been created in a very sort of futuristic way, this space. We're not. We're in a cozy home watching TV screens that are stacked on top of each other, and the way these lives are being watched is with VHS tapes. And Edson Oda has said that he chose VHS tapes because they're from his childhood, and so he's nostalgic about them, but also because Will's character died in the 80s, and so that's the space that Will comes from. And so the technology that's used in the film is from that time. And I suppose it hits a nostalgic button for me too, because it's from my teen years. So we're in this otherworldly space with conventions that are unfamiliar to us, with these mystical questions being considered, and yet we're engaged with this, again, very tactile, very grounded technology that is actually now considered old, that was once modern, that was once futuristic, but is now traditional, right? So that whole smash up is really exciting to me. And there are a lot of things that are explained about how this whole process works and this world works, and there are a lot of things that aren't explained about how this process and this world works. And again, with world building, that's always a balance, right? Like, how much does the audience need to know what's necessary, what's not necessary? What does the filmmaker want to give us? What does the filmmaker want to withhold from us? We don't learn a lot about Winston Duke's character's background. And I love the balance that's struck in this film of what we know and what we don't know, and what's left to mystery. And there are people who took issue with that. There are reviewers who took issue with what we're handed and what we're not handed. But I was totally along for the ride of the balance that was struck here. And Edson Oda has said, you know, it's true in life. There are things we know and there are things we don't know. And he's actually said that the gap between those two things is where, you know, religion and spiritual practice sort of come in to kind of help us manage that gap. And he doesn't see this as a religious movie at all, but it is a movie asking the bigger questions about, you know, who we are and why we're here and why there's suffering and how we move through suffering. And Edson Oda has an interesting background. He's a Japanese Brazilian filmmaker who started out in advertising and then directing commercials and music videos. But at some point, he realized that he had a call to tell deeper stories. And so he left his career and he went to film school. And this is his first film, his debut feature that he both wrote and directed. And he won the Sundance Writing Award for his script, in fact. But he was moved to tell this story because when he was 12, his 50-year-old uncle killed himself. And one of the things he realized after that was that the major thing that got sort of identified with his uncle after that time was his suicide and not his life, even though he had lived for 50 years and he was a really creative, sensitive, wonderful person. And so that was kind of the seed that around which Edson Oda built this film about life and death and our choices and how we manage what we go through, how we survive what we go through, how we don't survive what we go through. So Edson Oda spent several years massaging and perfecting this script before he started sending it out. And it's kind of a coup that for a feature debut, he got actors who are working on, much bigger projects to work on this independent, smaller film. So, Winston Duke starred in Black Panther and Avengers Endgame and in Jordan Peele's Us. And as I said, Zazie Beetz has been, in really successful TV shows as well as some huge movies and Emmy nominated also. So for both of them to choose to work on this smaller independent project with a first-time writer-director was a great catch. And they've both said that when they first read the script, the world made perfect sense to them. They weren't confused or disoriented. They didn't have a lot of questions. And they said when they got to the set was pretty much how they had envisioned it in their mind. So either, Edson Oda's work in, refining the script really paid off, or they were kind of in touch with what the vision was. And Winston Duke has said that he always looks in a script for the character's arc and does the character end in a different place from where they started. And he also thinks about the fact that he's a Black man and what does his identity as a Black man bring to a script and how does that change what's going on. And he felt strongly that the opportunity to tell such a sort of spiritual and psychological story and reflective story was maybe something that we haven't seen very often in cinema with a Black actor in the role, and he really liked that opportunity. And then Zazie Beetz has said that she really liked that there was this world building element, this sort of otherworldly element, and a deeply emotional element at the same time, and the opportunity to kind of work on both those levels at the same time drew them in. So we follow Will and Zazie Beetz' character Emma, as well as the other candidates for this next life, through 9 days of being interviewed so that Will can make his decision about who will get to go on to have a life. And the real drama centers around Will's character and Emma's character. And Emma sees Will and challenges Will in ways that haven't happened for him, we presume, in a long time, that kind of break open what he's been living with in his in-between not living, not dead state, while he's been doing this job he has, this spiritual job he has. And, I don't think this movie reflects my personal cosmology at all, and yet I love that someone made a film, exploring a potential cosmology and what the sort of bringing human vulnerability and experience to this question of how we get here and what happens when we leave, even though it's much more about the questions than the answers. We're not provided with some pat explanation for everything that happens in the world. We're just exploring a possibility, and through that, the human experience. And the acting is so beautiful in this film and so vulnerable, and there's something deeply tender about the film, which was also true of Afterlife. And Edson Oda has said that he sort of wanted to tell his own version of a story that called up the same kind of feelings in him that had been called up in him when he saw Afterlife. And for me, he really did. And I just, at the end of the film, I'm deeply moved and sort of awed by the generosity of spirit in the film and the beauty of it. So if you haven't seen 9 Days, please go see 9 Days. It's a beautiful experience. Let me know what you think in the comments, and please remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you next Wednesday. Thanks for watching Real Takes. Hit the subscribe button below so the algorithms will tell you when new episodes are out. And if you want to support Real Takes, please visit my Patreon page where you can join at any tier from $2 to $100 per thing I make. The $15 tier is specifically about supporting Real Takes, and you'll get behind the scenes information and be thanked in future videos. See you next Wednesday.